The Ottoman Empire conquered half the world, but DNA revealed that the conquerors were genetically far more conquered than anyone expected. At its height, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to the Horn of Africa. For 6 centuries, it was one of the most powerful political entities on Earth, governing a territory larger than any European state, administering dozens of languages and religions, and projecting military and cultural force across 3 continents. Istanbul, the city once called Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, became the center of a new civilization that claimed the inheritance of Rome, of the Caliphate, and of the Turkic steppe tradition simultaneously. The Ottomans were Turks, or so the story went, descended from Central Asian nomadic warriors who had swept westward out of the steppes of Inner Asia, converted to Islam, and carried their language and their identity across Anatolia and beyond. This origin narrative was not merely historical. It was foundational to Turkish national identity as it was constructed in the 20th century, particularly under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, whose modernizing reforms sought to anchor the new Republic of Turkey in a proud lineage of Turkic civilization stretching back to the Central Asian homeland, a homeland deliberately celebrated in museums, in school curricula, and in national mythology as the source of what it meant to be Turkish. Then the DNA arrived, and it told a story that neither the Ottoman sultans nor the founders of the Turkish Republic had anticipated. Modern Turks, when their genomes are analyzed against global reference populations, show a genetic profile that is overwhelmingly Anatolian and broadly Western Eurasian in character. The Central Asian Turkic ancestry, the genetic signal from the nomadic populations of the Eurasian steppe that national mythology places at the heart of Turkish identity, is present, but in proportions far smaller than the historical narrative would lead anyone to expect. Studies published through the 2010 and 2020, using both modern DNA from living Turkish populations across all regions of the country and ancient DNA from pre-Ottoman and Ottoman-era skeletal remains excavated at sites throughout Anatolia, consistently find the same pattern. The dominant ancestral component in modern Turkish genomes is not Central Asian. It is Anatolian, the same deep Anatolian ancestry that has been present in the region since the Neolithic period, the same genetic substrate that underlies modern Greek, Armenian, and broader Caucasian populations. The Turks are, genetically, the heirs of Anatolia, and Anatolia is very, very old. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Turkification of Anatolia actually was. The Seljuk Turks, the immediate predecessors of the Ottomans, began entering Anatolia in significant numbers from the 11th century CE, following their decisive victory over the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a battle that opened the Anatolian plateau to Turkic settlement, and is traditionally treated as the beginning of the end of Byzantine control over Asia Minor. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century accelerated this process considerably, bringing additional waves of Turkic and Mongolic peoples westward, some fleeing the Mongols themselves, others incorporated into Mongol-led armies that swept through the region. Over the subsequent centuries, the population of Anatolia underwent a profound cultural, linguistic, and religious transformation. The Greek, Armenian, Syriac, and other languages that had dominated the peninsula for centuries gradually gave way to Turkish. Christianity gave way to Islam. The institutional frameworks of Byzantine civilization were absorbed into and eventually replaced by those of the emerging Ottoman state. But here is what the genetics reveal about this transformation that the political and cultural history obscures. The people who underwent this linguistic and religious change, who began calling themselves Turks, praying in mosques, speaking Turkish, were, in overwhelming biological majority, the same Anatolian people who had always been there. The Seljuk and Ottoman conquest of Anatolia was, in genetic terms, primarily a cultural conquest rather than a demographic one. The Central Asian warriors who initiated this transformation were relatively few in number, and while they left a measurable genetic imprint on the Anatolian population, it was not large enough to fundamentally reshape the genome of a region that had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years by a substantial indigenous population. A 2021 study published in Current Biology, analyzing ancient DNA from sites across Anatolia spanning from the Bronze Age through the Ottoman period, documented this transition with unprecedented clarity. The researchers found that the genetic profile of Anatolian populations showed remarkable continuity from the Bronze Age through the Byzantine era, with the genetic signal of incoming Turkic groups appearing clearly, but in proportions that indicated admixture with rather than replacement of the existing population. The Turkic newcomers married into, absorbed, and were absorbed by the Anatolian communities they settled among. The children of these unions were culturally Turkic, but genetically more Anatolian than Central Asian. The estimates for the Central Asian genetic component in modern Turkish genomes vary across studies, but consistently fall in the range of 10 to 25%, with the remainder attributable to the ancient Anatolian, Caucasian, Balkan, and broader Western Eurasian ancestry that predates any Turkic presence in the region. In some regional Turkish populations, particularly in Western Anatolia and the Aegean coastal areas with historically dense Byzantine Greek settlement, the Central Asian component is even lower, sometimes falling below 10%. In Eastern Anatolian populations with historically closer connections to Central Asian migration routes and greater historical exposure to waves of Turkic settlement, it is somewhat higher, but in no modern Turkish regional population does the Central Asian steppe component approach a majority. The genetic majority of modern Turks traces not to the steppes of Inner Asia, but to the Neolithic farmers of Anatolia, the Bronze Age populations of the Aegean and Caucasus, and the multi-ethnic communities of the Byzantine world, the very civilizations that the Ottoman Empire is historically understood to have conquered and replaced. There is a historical irony embedded in this finding that becomes visible only once the genetics are properly understood. The Ottoman state, at its administrative peak, was one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse political entities in human history. Its ruling class included Albanians, Greeks, Slavs, Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, and Caucasians alongside Turks of Central Asian descent. Many of them converted Christians who had risen through the Devshirme system of elite recruitment, a practice in which Christian boys from Balkan and Anatolian families were taken into the imperial service, converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman culture, and formed into the administrative and military backbone of the empire. The Janissaries, the empire's legendary elite military corps, and one of the primary instruments of its conquest, were drawn predominantly from these Christian families of the Balkans and Anatolia. The soldiers who carried the Ottoman flag across 3 continents were, in many cases, the grandsons of Byzantine Christians, genetically and ancestrally part of the very populations the Ottoman state ruled. The conquerors and the conquered were, in a very literal biological sense, the same people. What the DNA adds to this picture is a deeper temporal layer that stretches far beyond the Ottoman or even the Byzantine period. The genetic continuity connecting modern Turks to pre-Ottoman Anatolian populations does not begin in the medieval period. It stretches back thousands of years before the Seljuks or the Ottomans ever arrived, rooted in one of the most ancient continuously inhabited regions on Earth. The Neolithic farmers who first cultivated the Anatolian plateau around 8,000 years ago were, as later genetic research confirmed, among the founding populations of European civilization, itself the ancestors of the Anatolian farming wave that swept across the continent, carrying agriculture and new genetic material from Asia Minor all the way to the Atlantic coast. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Hittites, the Lydians, and the Phrygians built their states on this same Anatolian foundation. The Hellenistic populations who adopted Greek language and culture after Alexander's conquests were the same people, absorbing a cultural transformation not unlike the one that would occur again a millennium later with the arrival of Turkish. The Byzantine Christians who defined the region for 1,000 years carried this same ancestral substrate. All of these populations contributed to the genetic foundation that the incoming Turkic migrants encountered and merged with. Modern Turkish DNA is, in this sense, a palimpsest of Anatolian human history stretching from the agricultural revolution to the present, with the Central Asian Turkic component representing the most recent and, genetically speaking, relatively thin layer added to an ancient and deeply rooted foundation. There is a man living today in Ankara whose family has spoken Turkish for as many generations back as anyone can remember. He prays in a mosque, observes the traditions of his faith, and takes pride in a national identity built on the legacy of Ottoman civilization and the Turkic heritage that Atatürk's republic celebrated. His genome, if sequenced and analyzed, would show ancestry connecting him most closely to populations from ancient Anatolia, from the Caucasus, from the Aegean world populations that his cultural tradition may identify as other, as Byzantine, as pre-Turkish, as the world that Turkish civilization transformed. The DNA does not agree with this framing. It does not recognize the political and cultural transformation of the 11th through 15th centuries as a biological event of comparable magnitude. It records, instead, a continuity so deep and so old that the arrival of Turkish language and Islam reads, at the genomic level, as a relatively recent modification of an identity that is, in its bones, far older and far more Anatolian than any national mythology has been built to fully acknowledge. History is not written in books. It is written in genomes. And the Turkish genome writes a history of Anatolia, not of the Central Asian steppe, a history of 10,000 years of farming, trading, conquering, being conquered, changing names and languages and religions while remaining, in the deepest biological sense, the people of this particular river, this particular plateau, this particular crossroads between Europe and Asia that has been continuously inhabited and continuously transformed since the very beginning of agricultural civilization. The Ottoman Empire did not bring its people to Anatolia. It found its people already there and became them. The empire that conquered half the world was itself, in the most fundamental sense. Conquered by the land, it ruled absorbed into an Anatolian identity so ancient and so deeply rooted that 6 centuries of imperial power left less of a mark on the genome than 10,000 years of living in the same place.